This item piqued my interest in an architectural salvage store a few weeks ago. I could see by its label it was called a Loy. I'd heard the name before, and I'd definitely seen them in use in old photos and archived footage. But now here one was right in front of me in the flesh. Right away I saw an opportunity to buy, replicate and use this old tool in order to explore what I had no doubt was a rich and interesting history. The price tag was an eye-watering €120. A lot to pay for a piece of rotting ash with a rusty piece of wrought iron attached to it. Perhaps it was the few rusty chisels the lads threw in to sweeten the deal, or my unwillingness to leave these places empty-handed, especially with the added pressure of the ever-looming closing time. Either way, I drove home that evening with the Loy by my side. With the Loy back in my workshop, I set about replicating it. Seeing as originally this tool would have been made entirely by hand, I said I would do the exact same thing in honour of the original. The ash used in this project was felled by my friend Connor up in North Cork about 12 years ago. He had to clear the trees to make way for a house he was building. He had all the best intentions of turning it into furniture, and called out another friend of ours, Mark Donnelly, with his mobile sawmill to cut it up into slabs and planks. As we all know too well, life often does not afford us the time to finish all these projects we had every intention of starting, so the timber lay in a shed ever since. Connor was clearing out the shed recently, and he messaged me asking me did I want any of the timber. I gladly accepted and called up the following day to pluck out anything that wasn't rotted or eaten with woodworm. I took all my measurements from the original Loy using the vernier calipers here, and then transcribed them onto our stock. The first cut we made with our Diston D8 rip cut saw here. It's my favourite saw in the toolbox. You use both hands to just cut down along the length of our wood, following our line. Rip cut saws like this would have been commonplace in every woodworking shop before the table saw took over. Like any saw, you want to have a good sharp edge on it, and just move your arms back and forward in a straight line, letting the saw do all the work for you. Most of the saws that you see for sale in stores today have plastic handles and tempered teeth. The tempered teeth hold a sharper edge for much longer, but once inevitably they do go dull, they cannot be sharpened, so oftentimes the saw is just disposed of. These old saws, on the other hand, with care and regular maintenance, that's oiling the blade and sharpening the teeth, can last literally generations. So we've used our rip cut saw here to rip down along the length of our ash. You can see there, just now we've made it to our line, happy days, but we're going to need a different saw in order to cut across the grain. But before we go cracking out any saw, I'm using my draw knife here to remove the bark. Oftentimes bark can be hiding little bits of stone or maybe some dirt, which if they come in contact with the teeth of our saw, it's a very quick way to blunten them. So we'll put away our rip cut saw now and pick up our cross cut saw. This saw has teeth filed in a way that they're designed to slice right across the wood fibres. This saw was in a dire state when I first got it, but half a day's work cleaning up the blade, sharpening the teeth and oiling the handle, and she's a fully functional tool once more. And then we're moving on to our next rip cut. This time we're going a lot faster because we're only ripping through 2 inches of material as opposed to 4. To maximise the amount of area the footrest takes up, I'm curving the cut towards the very end, which isn't recommended as it can kind of cause the saw to jam, but I used a bit of oil and I took my time, and I think we got there in the end. So while I'm hard at work making the Loy there, I think I'll take the time to bore you guys with some of the details surrounding a Loy. So I suppose we can start off with what is a Loy. A Loy, I suppose, could be defined as a traditional Irish spade with a long, narrow, slightly curved blade, typically used for tilling soil in areas where ploughs were impractical, like rocky or wet land, which Ireland has a lot of. The word Loy itself comes from the Irish word loyi, L-A fada, I fada, which translates to spade. The Loy was widely used in Ireland from medieval times all the way up until the early 20th century. It was especially common in poor rural areas where people farmed small plots of land, often on steep or boggy ground. Unlike the plough, which required an ox or a horse to draw, the Loy was a manual tool, making it accessible to small farmers. The Loy would have been made by rural craftspeople. Traditionally, Loys were made from ash due to its strength, flexibility and durability, and then the blade at the end of it was forged by a blacksmith out of wrought iron or steel, but we'll explore much more into that later. The blade on the Loy is set at an angle, which makes it a lot easier to drive into the ground with one body weight. The Loy would have been mainly used for lazy bed farming. This is a method where trenches are dug and the soil is piled on top and seed potatoes are inserted. But we're going to be doing a demo on that at the end of the video, so stay tuned. As well as this, however, the Loy was also used for cutting turf and digging drains. Historically, Irishmen known as Spalpini Fánacha meaning wandering landless labourer, were so renowned for their strength and expertise with hand tools such as the Loy, they even travelled abroad for seasonal work. This work would have included tasks like trench digging, and these labourers played a significant role in constructing railways and canals all over the world. During my research for this video, I stumbled across a group called Come On Loy na Heron, English name, the Loy Association of Ireland. This association was founded in 1992 and aims to foster the tradition of using a Loy to turn the sod, and let people know the sort of spade that was used before the introduction of the factory spade in 1750. They aim to show young people and future generations how food used to be produced in the past. They hold competitions in Loy digging to demonstrate the skills involved in this ancient art in order to popularise Loy digging across the 32 counties of Ireland. These Loy competitions sounded like great crack altogether, and I sure as hell wanted to be involved in the next one. The website hadn't been updated in 2 years, so I couldn't see anything about any upcoming events, but luckily the former chairperson had his number on the website, so I gave him a ring. James was very obliging. He told me there was a ploughing championship taking place up in County Longford in less than 2 weeks' time, and there'd be a Loy digging competition happening that day. He told me if I was making my way up to give him a shout in advance, and he'd introduce me to some of the remaining Loy makers. I'll bring up my own Loy that I'm making here, and I'm sure they'll no doubt have some constructive criticism for me. It makes me very happy to know that this kind of stuff is still happening in this country, so I'm definitely going to try my best to make my way up for that competition. Who knows, we might get a part 2 out of this Loy yet. So our stock being slightly too small means we still have this live edge here, but if live edges are good enough for contemporary furniture, they'll surely be to God good enough for contemporary Loys. We give our Loy a quick rub with some sandpaper and finish it with a single coat of linseed oil. The original Loy looks untreated to me, but I said 1 coat of oil wouldn't do my one any harm. With our finish applied, that wraps up the woodworking side of things, but you might notice that the Loy is not yet completed. Absent still is that essential wrought iron blade. Now I'll work wood all day long, but metallurgy is a bit beyond my jurisdiction. For that, we'll need a blacksmith.
Fuck off with that thing, will ya?
Although once upon a time there would have been 2 forges less than an hour's walk from my home, those days are long since past. I had to travel an hour and a half up the country to Limerick to meet with my good friend James O'Connor. James is a formally educated traditional blacksmith. Although I'd met James a few times, we really got to know each other last summer when we were both employed to give demonstrations outside the courtyard of Bunratty Castle and Folk Park. The two crafts complement each other very well, and me and James worked on numerous projects together over the summer. From little things like tools, he'd make the head and I'd make the handles, to larger projects like the guillotine that we got to make towards the end of our residency. Up until about the 60s, the blacksmith could have been found in every locality, be it forging gates, tools or repairing agricultural equipment. The blacksmith was a pillar of any community. The introduction of fabricated steel, as well as the replacement of horse-driven agricultural equipment with a tractor, marked the beginning of the end for the traditional blacksmith. Today, there are still a number of traditional blacksmiths still in operation. Although the traditional work demanded of the blacksmith is gone, today's smiths can still earn a living restoring heritage ironwork, taking on commissions, and giving demonstrations at craft shows and fairs. Another key difference between the old and the new is that of the material being used. The blade on my original Loy is made out of wrought iron, but here James is using a bit of steel to forge the blade for my replica. Traditional wrought iron was made using incredibly labour-intensive methods, which proved inefficient and costly. Although wrought iron is a lot easier to work, as soon as steel production became more advanced and economical, wrought iron was phased out. Although wrought iron is no longer in production, it's still the material of choice for the traditional blacksmith. As well as being malleable and easy to forge and weld, wrought iron is incredibly resistant to corrosion due to high slag inclusions inside the metal. James tells me there's wrought iron gates around the place that are 200 or 300 years old and they're still hanging. The only way to get wrought iron nowadays is to reclaim it. You can find it in cartwheel bands, old gates, or even by heating up and then straightening out the chain links on an old ship's anchor. For this reason, wrought iron is much more expensive than steel. I don't imagine it'll make much if any difference for the functionality of this tool, but I did think it was worth mentioning. As you can see here, James is using his power hammer, which isn't exactly the most traditional of methods. But given that steel, like we mentioned, is much harder to work than wrought iron, and the fact that traditionally blacksmiths would have had a striker, let's say an apprentice or an employee, whose job it was to strike the hot iron while the smith held it, so I think we'll leave him off for using the power hammer under these circumstances. All said and done, it only took James about 2.5 hours to forge this entire finished blade from an original piece of stock steel. In order to fit it onto the ash handle, he heated it up to what he called a black heat, tapping it securely in place with a hammer before quenching it in a bucket of water. The sudden cooling in the water caused the metal to contract, locking it securely onto the handle. And there it is now, and James only delighted with himself after a job well done. With a bag of seed potatoes purchased and our Loy fully finished and ready to go, there was only one thing left to do, and that was put it to the test. Now my mother wasn't too keen on the idea of me digging up our back garden so that I could plant a few spuds, but fortunately for me, her mother, my grandmother, was more than happy for me to plant a few rows of spuds in her back garden in the very same field that my great grandfather had planted them in many years ago. First thing I did was drive some stakes into the ground and tie a string between them. This allowed me to mark out a nice straight line to start our rows. Imagine if we had some wonky lines, what the neighbours would think. No, couldn't be us. This spade was gifted to our family by a forestry worker over 40 years ago, and it's my grandmother's pride and joy. Tragically, I broke the handle on this expedition. Now I do know a guy who fixes those kinds of things, so I'll get that sent off to him as soon as I can. Luckily I had a spare spade in the van, so I was able to crack that out. The method here was fairly simple. Basically just slice out 2 1-foot wide trenches placed 3 feet apart from each other, running parallel. On top of the 3 feet between the 2 trenches, you can place either seaweed, or in this case I have some decomposed grass and other cuttings from the garden that I'm going to use. Look at that for the best of soil, full of nitrates. Imagine now if you were a potato, this stuff would be rocket fuel. So what I did next was I used my Loy to fold the sods I had cut on top of the topsoil I had just placed. Telling you lads, what has happened to these old folks? There's no work in them. All they ever do is go on phone and give out. In fairness, I have a cousin who's racing in Cheltenham this week, so she had to show me the video of his horse being loaded up onto the trailer before the long journey. But once we had all our sods turned, it was time to plant our spuds. The variety I have here are called roosters. I simply pressed them down into the soil in rows of 3 spaced about 9 or 10 inches apart from each other. Next I went to cover everything up with some soil from the trenches, but I did it wrong unfortunately. After a quick demonstration on how you were supposed to do it, I was back on track, covering up all our spuds and all our soil just in time for lunch. After a cup of tea and a few slices of bread and butter, I was ready for go once more. So I had made 10 feet of lazy bed before lunch, and after doing a quick maths, I'd realised I needed to plant 18 more feet if I wanted to get rid of this full bag of spuds, and so I got to work. You can't really talk about Irish history and potato farming without bringing up the famine. Although it was the laissez-faire economic decisions of an uncaring and oppressive ruler that led to the mass depopulation of the Irish countryside, the demise of Irish customs, traditions and language, and of course the scattering of our population to the 4 corners of the planet, the overdependence on the potato crop to sustain a population of 8 million people and its consequential failure obviously had a large part to play in one of the darkest chapters of our history. Remnants of this crop failure still linger. Take for example the ridges that are to this day visible on some mountainsides. These are what remain of lazy beds, just like the one I'm planting here, that were never harvested, either because the crop failed or because there was nobody left to harvest it. My brother Callum was driving home from college when he saw me digging up Nan's garden. Curiosity got the better of him and he said he'd nosy on in to see what was happening. No, that's why he's in college. Luckily for him, he showed up 5 minutes before the work was finished, so he got to keep those nice shoes of his squeaking clean. All the while I was working outside and Nan was working inside, baking up some scones. A delicious treat after I'd all the spuds planted. That's delicious, thanks Nan. Well, I hope you've enjoyed. Researching, replicating and using the Loy has been an absolute pleasure. We'll see now how we get on in the Loy digging competition next week. Who knows, there might be a future for me as a Loy boy yet. Until next time, slán go fóill.